Milwaukee, Wisconsin, July 22nd, 1991. A humid summer night thick enough to taste in the air. The streets around North 25th Street were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Most people were inside, windows open, fans beating the heat, never imagining that inside one particular building, a nightmare was clawing its way into the open. At 11:30 p.m., a man runs through the intersection barefoot, shirt half torn, wrists marked with metal. His name is Tracy Edwards, and the metal around his wrist is a pair of handcuffs he cannot remove. His chest heaves, and he keeps looking behind him as if something unspeakable might step out of the shadows. He flags down a Milwaukee patrol car. Officers Rolf Mueller and Robert Rouse stop immediately. Tracy stumbles toward them, shaking so violently he can barely speak. "He tried to kill me," he whispers. "He put those on me. He has a knife." The officers exchange a glance. This neighborhood was known for disturbances, but not like this. Not with a man whose eyes look like he has stared directly into the face of something inhuman. "Who did this to you?" they ask. Tracy lifts his arm, handcuffs dangling like a cold warning. "The guy in apartment 213, Jeffrey Dahmer." Silence falls for a moment. Just a routine check, they think. Just a strange man with strange behavior. They were wrong. They were about to open the door to one of the darkest crime scenes in American history. The hallway leading to apartment 213 is narrow, quiet, and humid. The carpet is stained, the walls slightly discolored from years of cooking, heat, and neglect. Nothing unusual for the Oxford apartments. But there is one thing the officers immediately notice: the smell. A heavy, rotten chemical smell drifting faintly under the door of apartment 213. Something their instincts don't like. Mueller knocks. A soft voice responds, calm, too calm. Jeffrey Dahmer opens the door. He stands there shirtless, glasses reflecting the hallway light, expression almost apologetic, as if the situation were just an inconvenience. "Is there a problem, officers?" Tracy, standing behind them, instantly steps back. Something inside the apartment makes every hair on the officer's arms rise. This man, he looks ordinary, quiet, polite, a little awkward. Someone you wouldn't look twice at in a grocery store. But behind that calmness, something is wrong. "Why is he in handcuffs?" Officer Mueller asks. Dahmer shrugs. "It's just a misunderstanding. We were drinking, fooling around." He says it almost casually, hoping they will let it go. But the officers step inside. The smell hits them stronger now, sweet, sour, chemical, and foul all at once. A smell they will never forget. The officers look around, a small, cluttered living room. A fish tank bubbling faintly. A blue 57-gallon drum in the corner that looks wildly out of place. A bedroom door nearly closed. Something feels wrong. The air feels heavy. Mueller asks for the key to the handcuffs. Dahmer points toward the bedroom. "Key is in the dresser," he says. That's when Officer Mueller steps closer to the bedroom and sees something on the nightstand. A stack of Polaroid photographs. He picks one up. A man, posed strangely. Another photo, more disturbing. Another, something that steals the breath right from his lungs. These aren't just photographs. These are crime scene photos. Photos taken inside this apartment. Of bodies. Disassembled. Arranged. Documented like trophies. Mueller freezes. Ralph sees his partner's face change, color draining out. "What is it?" he whispers. Mueller turns to him and says the words that change everything. "These are real. These are not staged." Behind them, they hear Dahmer's breathing shift. Quiet, rapid, like a cornered predator. Then, a flash of movement. Jeffrey lunges. The officers wrestle him to the floor, but his strength shocks them. It takes both officers to bring him down. Handcuffs snap around Jeffrey Dahmer's wrists. In the scuffle, the bedroom door swings open wider. What the officers see inside the room will haunt them for the rest of their lives. A fridge humming softly, a faint trail of blood on the side, the open drawers containing tools, and the blue barrel sealed with industrial tape, giving off a stench that confirms their worst fears. Officer Mueller whispers, almost to himself, "My God, we're in hell." Backup arrives, detectives arrive, crime lab teams arrive. Over the next hours, investigators opened the refrigerator, then the freezer, then the closets, then the barrel. Inside apartment 213, they find preserved remains, bones, tools, dozens upon dozens of photographs, and evidence confirming the fears the officers could barely speak aloud. The apartment becomes a museum of nightmares, a place where years of horror were committed behind a plain white door. Neighbors gather outside, stunned. Some cry, some pray. Some say they always knew something was strange. The smells, the noises, the excuses about spoiled meat. But no one had imagined this, not even close. As police escort Jeffrey Dahmer out of the building, cameras flashing, neighbors shouting, the world begins asking the same question. How did an ordinary-looking man hide this level of darkness for over a decade? How did he walk among people unseen, unnoticed, unchallenged? How did a quiet man in glasses become one of the darkest killers in American history? To answer that question, we must go back. Back to where the shadows began. Back to a lonely boy in Ohio. Back to the childhood of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. And that is where our story turns next. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But his earliest memories, those that shaped him, fractured him, and hollowed him, were formed in the quiet, wooded suburbs of Bath Township, Ohio. From the outside, his childhood looked painfully ordinary. A small house, a dog, a younger brother, and two parents who seemed educated and ambitious. But inside that house lived a kind of turbulence no child should have to endure. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was a hard-working chemistry student turned research scientist, logical and often distant. His mother, Joyce, battled depression, anxiety, and a dependence on prescription medication that only deepened her instability. Their arguments were frequent, sharp, and exhausting. They fought behind closed doors, in the living room, in the kitchen, sometimes loudly enough that Jeffrey's small body would tense even before the shouting began. He never knew what version of his parents he would wake up to, but he learned early that silence was safer than asking questions. Jeffrey withdrew, not dramatically, not in a way that teachers could easily flag, just a little quieter, a little more absent, his eyes a little more unfocused in class. He learned to sit at the edges of rooms, unnoticed. The world already seemed far away, and he drifted from it early. By the time he was 6, he discovered something that stirred him in ways he didn't yet understand: dead animals. He found them on walks through the woods, roadkill, bones, decomposing bodies, small creatures that nature had left behind. While other children ran from such things, Jeffrey stopped. He stared. He wanted to understand what they looked like on the inside. He would bring carcasses home, dissect them, study the bones, bleach them with chemicals he found in his father's workshop. Lionel initially encouraged the interest, thinking it was a budding fascination with science, maybe even a path toward medicine or biology. But he didn't see what Jeffrey saw. For Jeffrey, the bones weren't just objects. They were the only things in his world that didn't leave him, didn't shout, didn't disappoint. When he held them in his hands, he felt a sense of control, a feeling that was missing from the rest of his life. As Jeffrey grew, that obsession didn't fade, it deepened. He began to fantasize, not just about animals, but about people, not about hurting them at first, but about keeping them close, keeping them silent, keeping them still. These were thoughts he never spoke aloud, thoughts he buried beneath a shy, awkward smile and an increasing desire to disappear into the background. Middle school turned into high school, and the distance between Jeffrey and everyone else widened. He struggled to make friends, struggled to connect, struggled to fit into any group. He was polite and soft-spoken, but painfully awkward, always on the outer ring of every social circle. And so he found new ways to cope. The alcohol came next. He began drinking at 14, hard liquor hidden in a jacket pocket, sips taken in bathroom stalls, gulps taken before class. Teachers noticed the smell, the glassy eyes, the slurred responses. Students joked about it, calling him the class clown alcoholic as he performed strange pranks, pretending to have seizures or imitating people with disabilities. It made others laugh, but the laughter was hollow, undeserved, and Jeffrey knew it. He wasn't drinking to have fun. He was drinking to quiet the storm inside his mind, those cold, creeping thoughts that had begun to shape themselves into something darker. By senior year, Jeffrey had slipped almost entirely into isolation. His parents' marriage collapsed. Fights turned into days-long battles, accusations into silence, silence and into separation. Lionel moved out of the house temporarily. Joyce withdrew emotionally and physically, leaving Jeffrey floating in the ruins of a broken home. It was during this time, this perfect blend of loneliness, abandonment, and festering obsession, that Jeffrey Dahmer felt something shift inside him. He was now 18, legally an adult, but emotionally more alone than he had ever been. And as the last members of his family drifted out the front door, he realized he was completely unsupervised for the first time in his life. The fantasies that had lived only in his head were no longer content to stay there. The urge for control, for possession, for the stillness he had once practiced on animals, began to turn towards something else, toward people, toward a young man he would soon meet, toward an act that would change the course of his life forever. The groundwork for Jeffrey Dahmer's first murder was already laid. All that remained was the moment that would push him across the line. In the summer of 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old and completely alone. His parents' marriage had finally shattered. Lionel had moved out months earlier. Joyce had left not long after, taking Jeffrey's younger brother with her. In the chaos and bitterness of their separation, both adults believed the other was watching Jeffrey. Neither of them was. The house in Bath Township, Ohio, once full of arguments, slammed doors, and tension, was now silent. A silence so thick it almost hummed. Jeffrey wandered through the empty rooms day after day, drinking, drifting, and feeling the old fantasies tighten their grip. He was abandoned, isolated, and untethered. For the first time in his life, there were no witnesses, no parents, no rules, no one to tell him no. Something dark settled over him during those weeks, something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. On June 18, 1978, the moment he had been circling for years finally found him. Jeffrey was driving along Bath Road, a quiet rural stretch of pavement lined with thick trees, when he saw a hitchhiker walking shirtless along the shoulder. The boy looked healthy, confident, sunlit. Everything Jeffrey felt he wasn't. His name was Stephen Mark Hicks, 19 years old, heading to a rock concert, carefree and smiling in the summer heat. Jeffrey slowed the car. He later said he didn't know why he stopped. But a lifetime of loneliness, obsession, and longing condensed into a single decision. He offered Stephen a ride. Stephen accepted. It should have been a brief encounter, just two teenagers driving to a house to listen to music and drink a few beers. But once Stephen stepped inside the Dahmer home, Jeffrey felt the shift. For the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. Someone was with him, talking, laughing, existing in his space. But Jeffrey sensed that it wouldn't last. Stephen mentioned he could only stay for a while. He had plans, a concert to get to, friends waiting. And that one sentence, "I have to go soon," unraveled something inside Jeffrey. The fear of abandonment, the dread of being alone again, the desire to stop time, to freeze this temporary companionship, it all surged through him at once. And the old fantasies, the ones he had carried since childhood, rose to the surface. As Stephen stood to leave, Jeffrey panicked. He reached for a dumbbell. The moment was fast, impulsive, born from a desperate need to prevent the boy from walking out the door. It was the act that would define the rest of his life, the line he could never step back from. Afterward, the house returned to silence. The silence he thought he hated, now smothering him. Jeffrey stood there, heart racing, trying to understand what he had done. There wasn't a grand, emotional collapse, nor a scream, nor panic. Instead, he felt something far more disturbing. Numbness, a cold, quiet stillness, a dark calmness that frightened him, yet pulled him in. He later admitted that part of him felt a strange thrill, a sense of control he had never felt over anything in his life. But Jeffrey wasn't thinking about the next hour or the next day. He wasn't thinking about investigators, consequences, or the moral weight of what he had done. His mind had narrowed entirely to one goal: making the problem disappear. Over the following days, he worked methodically, coldly, on what he needed to do. He used the basement. He used tools. He used the techniques he long understood from childhood experiments, but now applied to something far more horrific. He cleaned, concealed, and destroyed evidence in a way that left little for anyone to find. It was mechanical. It was emotionless. It was the beginning of a pattern. No one came looking for Jeffrey. No one suspected him. And when Stephen Hicks was reported missing, the police had no reason, no leads, no witnesses, no suspicion, to knock on the Dahmer door. Jeffrey remained alone in that house for weeks more, carrying the weight of what he had done, replaying the moment over and over again in his mind. But instead of fear pushing him away from the darkness, the quiet thrill pulled him closer. He had crossed a threshold, and though the world continued spinning outside his window, Jeffrey Dahmer's path had already begun to descend into shadows that no one around him could see. The first murder did not end his urges. It awakened them, and soon he would find himself on a path from which there was no return. After the murder of Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer drifted through life like a ghost wearing a human suit. He was never questioned, never suspected, never confronted. The world around him continued as normal, and Jeffrey, quiet, polite, unremarkable, slipped back into it as though nothing had happened. But that silence, that lack of consequence, only gave the darkness in him room to settle and grow. In January 1979, Dahmer enlisted in the U.S. Army. On paper, it looked like a fresh start, a chance to replace isolation with discipline, aimlessness with purpose. He trained as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, then was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany. For a while, his life took on a structured rhythm: barracks, routines, uniforms, orders. But structure couldn't fix what was already broken. His drinking, which had begun in high school, intensified. The alcohol didn't just quiet his mind, it buried it. And whenever the alcohol faded, the urges and fantasies resurfaced stronger than before. He became unreliable, unpredictable, and increasingly intoxicated. After multiple disciplinary issues, the Army decided he was no longer fit for service. In March 1981, he received an honorable discharge, quietly, cleanly, without any note of danger attached to his name. No one knew what he had done back in Ohio. No one even thought to ask. Instead of returning home, Jeffrey drifted to Miami Beach, Florida. He worked at a deli, slept in motels or on the beach, stayed constantly drunk, and burned through what little money he had. He lived in heat and haze, floating through the days with no direction. Eventually, he called his father and admitted he was homeless. Lionel flew him back to Ohio, unaware that the son he was trying to help had already crossed a line that most people cannot imagine. The return didn't last. Jeffrey's drinking worsened, and his behavior grew erratic. Lionel realized he couldn't live at home, so he sent him to stay with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, hoping a quieter environment might help. It was a well-intentioned decision, one that would unknowingly set the stage for Jeffrey's next transformation. Life at his grandmother Catherine's house was steady and structured. She was kind, religious, and patient. She kept an eye on Jeffrey, but not too closely. She hoped love and routine could fill whatever emptiness lived inside him. But Jeffrey felt the old urges growing again. He tried to drown them in alcohol. He tried to resist them through force of will, but nothing permanent took root. It started with small incidents, things that seemed strange but not criminal enough to fully raise alarms. He was arrested twice for disorderly conduct. Then came the 1982 harassment charge, where he exposed himself to a group of people at a fairground. Later in 1986, he was arrested again for indecent exposure, this time in front of two boys at a public park. These were early warning signs of a man spiraling, but they were treated as isolated acts of poor judgment, not pieces of a darker pattern. Meanwhile, Jeffrey discovered Milwaukee's gay bars and bathhouses, places where he could blend into the crowd, unnoticed and anonymous. But even here, his impulses twisted into something alarming. He began drugging men he brought to bathhouses, not to harm them, he claimed, but to keep them still, quiet, controlled. The idea of someone unconscious, unable to leave, unable to abandon him, filled a void that nothing else could. The bathhouses eventually banned him. His behavior was escalating, and the old darkness from 1978 was stirring again. By 1987, he felt the fantasies returning with a force he could no longer suppress. The alcohol no longer quieted them. The nightlife no longer distracted him. His grandmother, once a comforting presence, sensed that something in Jeffrey was shifting, though she could not name what it was. Jeffrey Dahmer was approaching another breaking point, one that would mirror the lonely summer night in Ohio almost a decade earlier. The pattern he had begun with Stephen Hicks was coming back to life. The desire for control, the fear of abandonment, the thrill of possession and stillness. And soon he would find himself in a hotel room, staring at a man he would later claim he killed without remembering how. The nightmare was waking up again. By late 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer had spent nearly a decade trying and failing to keep the darkness inside him contained. The urges that began with Stephen Hicks had returned, stronger and more demanding than ever. Jeffrey was drifting between bars, bathhouses, and the quiet rooms of his grandmother's house in West Allis, carrying with him a desperation he no longer tried to understand. His drinking intensified, his fantasies sharpened, and the distance between thought and action grew dangerously thin. Everything broke open on November 20th, 1987. That night, Jeffrey met Stephen Walter Tuomi, a 25-year-old man with an easy smile and an unassuming kindness. They encountered each other at a bar in Milwaukee, just two strangers looking for company. The interaction was normal, almost forgettable, but in Jeffrey's mind, it ignited something familiar. He persuaded Stephen to come with him to the Ambassador Hotel, room 507. The plan, Jeffrey later said, was not murder. He claimed he wanted company, intimacy, closeness, anything to keep the rising tide of loneliness at bay. They drank together, they talked, they fell asleep, and then Jeffrey woke up. Stephen was on the bed beside him, lifeless, bruised, unmoving. Jeffrey stared in horror, unable to piece together what had happened. He would later insist that he had no memory of hurting Stephen, that he had blacked out completely. The truth of that claim will never be known, but the result was undeniable. Jeffrey Dahmer had killed again. And this time he told himself he had crossed too far to turn back. He panicked. He acted quickly, but not like someone shocked by their own violence, more like someone stepping back into a familiar rhythm. Jeffrey transported Stephen Tuomi's body out of the hotel in a suitcase, rolling it casually through the lobby like nothing was wrong. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. No one sensed that anything horrific had occurred. Back at his grandmother's house, Jeffrey faced the same question he had confronted in 1978. What now? And quietly, coldly, he began to answer it. Over the following days, Jeffrey worked in the basement, alone, undisturbed. He concealed, cleaned, and eliminated evidence in a way that showed a deepening comfort with the process. The techniques he used were not impulsive anymore. They were practiced, calculated, evolving. It marked a turning point in his behavior, the shift from a moment of panic to a pattern of ritual. Jeffrey hid all signs of what had happened. His grandmother noticed strange smells, odd hours, and Jeffrey's increasing detachment, but she never imagined the truth unfolding only a few feet below her home. Stephen Tuomi was officially listed as a missing person. Jeffrey Dahmer was never questioned. The world didn't know a serial killer had awakened, and the pattern continued. During 1988, Jeffrey committed additional acts that mirrored the growing darkness inside him. He lured men from Milwaukee's bars, often drugging them to keep them still, his obsession with control deepening into something more sinister. But that same year, something happened that should have stopped him. In September 1988, Jeffrey encountered a 13-year-old boy whom he lured to the house under false pretenses. What followed was a crime that, for the first time, brought Jeffrey into direct contact with the police. The boy escaped. Dahmer was arrested. The investigation was serious. Finally, someone was looking at him clearly. Jeffrey was charged with second-degree sexual assault and enticement of a minor. He stood in court, quiet, polite, remorseful in appearance. His father begged for leniency. Psychologists recommended treatment, not incarceration, believing Jeffrey was troubled but treatable, disturbed but not dangerous. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. The judge sentenced him to 1 year in a work release program, not prison. He was allowed to keep his job, allowed to continue his life, allowed to return to society, a missed opportunity that cost many futures. When Jeffrey completed his sentence, he didn't move back with family. He didn't seek treatment. Instead, he moved into a small apartment on North 24th Street, and later to the infamous apartment 213 in the Oxford Apartments. For the first time, he had total freedom. No grandmother walking downstairs unexpectedly, no parents watching over him, no restrictions, no eyes, no interruptions. His impulses, once kept barely contained by circumstance, were now unchained. The murders, carefully spaced and hidden, were about to accelerate. His methods would refine, his fantasies would deepen, and Jeffrey Dahmer, now living alone in a quiet apartment in Milwaukee, had entered the most dangerous stage of his life. The spree had only just begun. By 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer had finally created what he had always wanted but never admitted: a private world where no one questioned him, no one interrupted him, and no one stopped him. Apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments became more than a home. It became a controlled environment where his darkest compulsions were allowed to thrive without resistance. From the hallway, neighbors often complained about the smells seeping from under his door, thick, sour, and unmistakably wrong. Sometimes it was accompanied by the scrape of metal or the dull thud of something heavy being moved. But Dahmer always had an explanation ready: spoiled meat, old fish, a broken freezer. The neighbors wanted to believe him, and he hid behind their politeness like armor. Inside, his life followed a rigid, twisted routine. He would head to the bars, scanning for someone who looked lonely, someone who needed quick money, or simply someone willing to trust him for a night. He used the same lines, the same calm smile, the same promises of photographs or easy cash. Once the door to apartment 213 closed, everything shifted. The room became silent, controlled, and suffocating, a place where Dahmer dictated every second. By 1991, his world was spinning faster, and he was losing the ability to hold it together. He drank constantly. He slipped at work. He grew careless. Yet even in the middle of that unraveling, he continued with the same pattern: inviting, isolating, and overpowering. And then came one of the most haunting moments in the entire story. The night of May 27, 1991, involving a 14-year-old boy named Konorak Synthesomphone. Dahmer lured him as he had others, but what followed exposed just how deeply flawed the system around him was. Konorak escaped, dazed, injured, and desperate, stumbling into the neighborhood and collapsing on the sidewalk. Neighbors called 911. Two women tried to protect him, insisting something was terribly wrong. Yet when the police arrived, Dahmer emerged from the darkness with an eerie calm. He told them it was a domestic dispute, that the boy was his partner, that everything was fine. Konorak couldn't speak for himself. The officers glanced briefly around the apartment doorway and made a fatal decision. They handed the boy back to Dahmer. They even joked about the situation on their radios as they drove away. Inside apartment 213, the cycle resumed, uninterrupted, unquestioned, and now strengthened by the knowledge that he could talk his way out of anything. The walls of that small unit continued to hide the escalating chaos, the drinking, the carelessness, the deepening obsession with control. Neighbors still complained about the stench. Dahmer still dismissed it with the same soft voice. Apartment 213 had become his entire world, a place where he felt invincible, even as everything around him was already beginning to crack. By the summer of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was spiraling out of control. He was drinking more heavily, slipping at work, and losing the careful discipline that had concealed his crimes for years. Yet he still prowled the bars, searching for someone who might follow him home. On the night of July 22nd, he found Tracy Edwards, a man whose calm instincts and quick thinking would finally bring the entire nightmare to an end. Dahmer lured Tracy to apartment 213 with the familiar promises: money, drinks, photos. But almost immediately, Tracy sensed something was wrong. The apartment smelled overpoweringly foul. Boxes and tools were scattered around without explanation. Dahmer's mood shifted rapidly, distant one moment, intense the next. Then came the handcuffs, One cuff snapped onto Tracy's wrist under the pretense of a photo pose. Moments later, Dahmer appeared with a knife, talking in a quiet, unnerving tone about wanting to take control. Tracy stayed calm. He talked to Dahmer, tried to humanize himself, tried to slow things down. When Dahmer's attention faltered, he seized his chance. He bolted out of the apartment, sprinting through the hallway and down the street with the handcuffs still attached to his wrist. He flagged down two Milwaukee officers. Breathless, terrified, he told them about the knife, the cuffs, the strange man who had tried to trap him. The officers agreed to check the apartment, something countless people before them had never done. When the door to apartment 213 swung open, the horrors inside were suddenly impossible for Dahmer to hide. While one officer spoke to him, the other wandered toward the bedroom. That's when everything unraveled. He saw the Polaroids, dozens of them, documenting the stages of Dahmer's victims inside the very apartment they were standing in. The photographs were so detailed, so unmistakably real, that the officer returned to the living room and simply said, "These are for real." In the next seconds, Dahmer tried to slip past them, but the officers tackled him to the floor. From that moment on, the mask never went back up. A deeper search of the apartment revealed the full scope of what had been happening behind the closed door of room 213. The freezer filled with wrapped packages no one dared to open at first. The blue barrel containing chemical solutions, drawers of tools, implements, and items no neighbor would ever imagine, and a smell that confirmed what the photos had already made undeniable. Through it all, Dahmer behaved with an eerie calm. No fight, no resistance, no attempt to deny what he'd done. He spoke flatly, almost clinically, as if relieved that the chase was finally over. He confessed in quiet detail, explaining patterns and habits with the same tone someone else might use to describe their daily schedule. The spree that had stretched across more than a decade ended. Not with a dramatic confrontation, but with one man's escape, two officers' curiosity, and the sudden collapse of the world Jeffrey Dahmer thought he had total control over. Once Jeffrey Dahmer was in custody, the truth poured out of him with disturbing clarity. For years, he had hidden behind excuses, routine, and the facade of an ordinary life. But now he confessed openly. Hour after hour, day after day, he described his actions to detectives with a level of detail that left even seasoned investigators shaken. It wasn't just what he admitted to, it was how calmly he spoke, as though finally releasing everything he had kept buried. His confession stretched across all 17 known victims. He recalled their names, the nights he met them, the patterns he repeated, and the rituals he built around control and possession. At moments he seemed detached, at others strangely reflective, but never remorseful in the way the families hoped to hear. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had lived in two worlds, one meticulously ordinary, one unimaginably dark. When the trial began in January 1992, the courtroom became a place where unimaginable grief finally had a voice. Families filled the benches, clutching photographs and memories. Some trembled, some cried, some held their anger with white-knuckled restraint. Victim impact statements broke the room open. Mothers spoke about the sons they would never see again. Brothers and sisters described the years of uncertainty, the sleepless nights waiting for answers. And most famously, one grieving sister's voice exploded across the courtroom when she confronted Dahmer, shouting the pain that words had failed to contain for too long. In those moments, the mask Dahmer wore during the proceedings, calm, quiet, emotionless, seemed to make the agony in the room even harder to bear. The judge delivered a sentence that spoke to the magnitude of the crimes, 15 consecutive life terms, effectively a promise that Dahmer would never walk free again. The courtroom exhaled, but the relief was strained, incomplete. Justice had been served, but justice could never return the lives lost. Dahmer entered the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, where he lived under close supervision. Over time, he developed a peculiar routine, reading, working quietly, interacting minimally. He spoke occasionally about faith, guilt, and punishment, but those who watched him always sensed something opaque, something closed off. His presence unsettled inmates and guards alike. In 1994, that uneasy equilibrium shattered. On the morning of November 28th, Dahmer was assigned to a small work detail along with two other inmates, one of them, Christopher Scarver. The supervision was looser than usual, for reasons Scarver later described as moral outrage, spiritual conviction, impersonal judgment. He attacked Dahmer in a secluded area of the prison. The blows were swift and fatal. When guards arrived, Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most infamous criminals in American history, lay unresponsive on the floor. His life ended violently, though far less mysteriously than the lives he had taken. Dahmer's death brought a sudden end, but not closure. His legacy is a landscape of scars. He exposed system failures at every level: police oversight, judicial leniency, missed warning signs, and moments when lives could have been saved but weren't. The case forced departments to reevaluate policies on missing persons, community outreach, and cultural biases that contributed to deadly mistakes, especially with vulnerable communities. His crimes also left Milwaukee with a generational trauma. Neighbors, friends, and family still speak of the lingering shadow he cast. The fear, the distrust, the grief that reshaped the city's sense of safety. And yet, society remains drawn to the story, not out of morbid curiosity alone, but because Dahmer represents a terrifying contradiction. Someone who looked unremarkably normal, living quietly in an average apartment building, hiding a darkness that no one could see until it was far too late. The final truth is the one that lingers long after the facts are told. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor.